After the Battle of Bull Run, a victory for the Southern forces, Walt Whitman wrote this in his book, Specimen Days.
Here in the federal city of Washington,
Monday, July 22nd, 1861.
The defeated troops commenced pouring into Washington over the Long Bridge at daylight, a day drizzling all through with rain.
The Saturday and Sunday of the battle had been parched and hot to an extreme. The dust, the grime, and smoke in layers sweated in, followed by other layers, again sweated in.
their clothes all saturated with the clay powder. It filled the air. It was stirred up everywhere in the dry roads and trodden fields by the regiments. All the men, with this coating of murk and sweat and rain, now recoiling back, pouring over the Long Bridge.
Returning to Washington, baffled, humiliated, panic-struck. Where are the vaunts and the proud boast with which you went forth? Where are your banners and your bands of music and your ropes to bring back your prisoners? Well, there isn't a band playing, and there isn't a flag that doesn't cling, ashamed, to its flagstaff.
The sun rises, but shines not. The men appear, at first sparsely and shamefaced enough, then thicker, and the streets of Washington appear on Pennsylvania Avenue.
They come along in disorderly mobs, some in squads, stragglers, companies. Occasionally, a rare regiment in perfect order, with its officers, there were some gaps, dead perhaps, marching in silence, with lowering faces, stern, weary to sinking, all black and dirty, but every man with his musket and stepping lively. But these were the exceptions.
Sidewalks of Pennsylvania Avenue jammed with citizens, women in the windows, curious expressions on their faces, and those swarms of dirt-covered returning soldiers there. They will never end. Moving by, but nothing said, no comments.
Good people, but not over many of them are preparing food for the soldiers. They put wash kettles on the fire for soup, for coffee. They set tables on the sidewalks. Wagon loads full of bread are purchased and then swiftly cut into stout chunks.
Here are two aged ladies, beautiful, cultured, and charming. They stand there providing food and drink at an improvised table made of rough planks. Their supplies are replenished from the house every half hour, all that day.
And there, in the rain, they stand, active, silent, white-haired, giving food, though the tears stream down their cheeks almost without intermission. In the whole time, they stand there.
Amid the deep excitement, crowds, and motion, and desperate eagerness, it seems strange to see many, very many, of the soldiers sleeping in the midst of it all, sleeping soundly. They drop down anywhere on the steps of houses, on the sidewalk, or in some vacant lot, and deeply sleep.
A poor 17 or 18-year-old boy lies there on the stoop of a grand house. He sleeps so calmly, so profoundly.
and on them, as they sleep, drips the rain.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now have an anthem. And this anthem's words are actually in your hymnal, number 356. But we're not going to ask you to join in. Just listen and enjoy. So Walt Whitman wrote a poem called To Workmen. Will you seek afar off? You surely come back at last. In things best known you find the best, or as good as the best. In the folks nearest you, finding the sweetest, strongest, lovingest. Happiness, knowledge, not in another place, but this place. Not in another hour, but this hour. The poem speaks of living one's own life, not trying to live someone else's. It speaks of loving the people you are with, finding the lovingest, not in another place, but this place, not another hour, but this hour. It's a sweet, simple lesson, perhaps a 19th century version of a call to mindfulness. In learning about Whitman's life and writings, I realized that he lived this philosophy, not just in good times. When the Civil War was injuring tens of thousands of soldiers, Whitman saw a place that he had to be and the work he had to do. Writing a letter home from a dying soldier, sitting with a soldier who was scared, giving small sums of money to Southern deserters who were heading north. He was not just present to the horrors of war, he was consumed within them. And in his book Specimen Days and The Wound Dresser, he leaves to posterity a record of what life was like. So much of learning about the Civil War is learning about the politics and what the generals did, or what the diplomats did, or what the ships did. Walt Whitman gives us a view of what the soldiers did, what the townspeople did, and a feeling of a scale of the human strife and drama and living. And yet, words can't tell the whole truth. In one book, Whitman complains about the fact that all portraits of Abraham Lincoln look like caricatures. There's no good portrait of the person who Lincoln was. In the same way, the quick descriptions of what Whitman did can't say what he did. They're only caricatures. Let's go to a different story. For years and years, I was an electronics engineer, and my job included a whole lot of travel. One weekend, I found myself in Dallas, Texas. I was going to say summer weekend, but it could have been any time of year in Texas because it's always hot down there. I had nothing to do for a whole weekend, but I did have a rental car, which is a really cool thing when you travel. Note to self, always have a rental car. So I went on a drive. I drove out past Fort Worth, which is near Dallas, and on to a place called Wise County, Texas. Anybody heard of Wise County, Texas? I hadn't either. The highway led into a small town, and there was the Wise County Museum, a tall brick building in the Romanesque style. And there was a sign out front that said open. So, having nothing better to do, I figured I'd stop in. The woman at the reception desk was kind of surprised that anybody had come to her museum that day. She took my $2 and then said, "I suppose you'll want to see the room. You can come back when you're ready. I'll give you the key. And then she went back to her filing. Well, anyway, the place was incredible. It had 20-foot tall ceilings, because it was Texas, and that's how you keep cool. You have really high ceilings. And there was this sort of faint, musty smell. I spent a half hour learning about the evolution of barbed wire in Texas. I can tell you a lot about that some other time, some other sermon, and looking at various pieces of donated china and wedding gowns from the 1890s. And all this time I was wondering, what's this room all about? What would I find there? Well, finally, I felt ready for an adventure. And so I asked her for the key. She gave it to me and directed me up a long stairway to a door that had a sign on it that said, "The Lost Battalion." How many of you have seen the movie Bridge on the River Kwai? This is more than the number that know about Wise County, Texas, which is a really good thing. Anyway, it came out in the late 1950s, and it was about prisoners of war building a bridge in Burma. It seems that I'd stumbled across the archives of a group of sailors, National Guardsmen, and soldiers who had been caught by Imperial Japan early in World War II. And that fictional story was loosely based on their story. These archives were the actual folks who had been captured and who built the Burma Railroad. In the Lost Battalion room, there were some posters of the film because some of the members of the group had been asked to be technical advisors to the movie. But there was a much more precious jewel. After the prisoners of war were liberated and they got back to the USA, the surviving American POWs started a tradition of staying in touch, getting together once a year. And they kept archives. In this room, each of the service members had a notebook with a history of their military service, where he was a POW and his date of military discharge. But the notebooks had been kept current with yearly updates on each man's life. I could, simply by taking down a binder from the shelf and paging through it, the collected letters and announcements, I could come along as a soldier, found a job, got married, raised a family, retired, and in some cases died. Another folder would have stories of divorce, of losing jobs, of moving around, maybe trouble with the law, alcoholism, recovery or not. And many of them had alcoholism or mental illness. It was there, the violence and the suicide, the tragedy and the wealth. In the movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai, of course, the men are best remembered for marching across the bridge whistling, right? Anybody remember the tune? We're not, oh. But here they became real people. They had real names. They had wives and hometowns. And it turns out a bunch of them came from Wise County, Texas. They were the National Guard group unit that got captured. But anyway, the movie's sense of happily ever after was recast, too. Now I could see the hard recovery from the trauma of war. They're being taken prisoner, loss, starvation. Each man's life had been documented in letters, notes from family members, photos, news clippings, and obituaries. The Lost Battalion organizers worked hard to keep everyone's life documented, the successes and the failures. As POWs, they developed a buddy system to make sure that everyone had someone that they talked to that looked out for them and that they had to look out for emotional support. As veterans, they extended the POW buddy system into a communal and perpetual promise to stay in touch. The archives created a unique way of seeing lives in that community. So let's fast forward again. While I was in seminary, I had a job as a chaplain intern at the Palo Alto Veterans Affairs Hospital in California. As chaplain, I would visit the bedsides of veterans recovering from surgery. Lots of the veterans were like some retired salesmen, technicians, roofers, even hospital workers. The people were very much like the old guys that I know in my hometown. And the war service was a distant memory. And I also worked in what was called the dual diagnosis ward. This is a ward for guys my age and a little bit older, actually starting 1 year older than me and going on up. The ward was locked. I had to be personally let in and out by the nursing staff. The patients had no belts in their pants or shoelaces in their shoes. They were Vietnam veterans mostly, who had what was called a dual diagnosis. That meant they were both addicted to something, usually alcohol, and they were also being evaluated for what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, the ward wasn't a PTSD treatment ward. It was a transition ward where the veterans could withdraw from their addictions, get stabilized enough to start treatment for PTSD. And the staff filled their days with activities, including a 1-hour spiritual session where a chaplain, make that be me, would come in and talk about various sorts of things. Actually, I remember most vividly a discussion group that my chaplain supervisor, did about the song Yankee Doodle in the American Revolution. And she asked people a bunch of questions and got people having opinions about Yankee Doodle and the like. And I think the goal of the discussion was to get the veterans accustomed to speaking out, accustomed to talking about things in a discussion, as opposed to get them used to hearing their own voices, actually. As a chaplain, I would also have individual sessions with the men. I'd sit down with a veteran and he'd talk about his life. Most were divorced. Most had lost families and friends, sometimes due to their behaviors. What I didn't notice at the time, but which I noticed later, was that the stories were just like the stories of the men of the Lost Battalion. I had heard this before, with a difference. But when these soldiers got home, the Vietnam veterans didn't have a community that held them in love the way that returning World War II veterans did. Everyone wanted to forget the Vietnam War. The VFW refused membership because it was a conflict, not a declared war, and the anti-war left, for the most part, couldn't separate the soldier, who was often a draftee, from the generals who ordered them to fight. Hatred of the war became hatred of the veteran. And rather than welcoming vets into jobs, industries sometimes avoided hiring them. That's what I heard. These men hid their memories, keeping them hidden with alcohol or drugs. They knew of no effective treatment, and so they self-medicated. Anyway, this sermon could continue to be a litany of my learnings from that summer at the VA. But the sermon is for you, not for me. So rather than going into any more detail, I'm going to transition and talk about some observations. And the biggest one is that the goal of those who fight wars is peace. For many, when the hostilities ended, service members could simply return to their lives. And yet, when a veteran returns, he or she isn't the same person. Some veterans needed continuing medical care, and we are a nation which deserves to provide this care unstintingly. Coping with the effects of combat can alter a veteran's behavior. This doesn't change their inherent worth and dignity. As someone who's not a veteran myself, I can't understand their feelings, emotions, their moral platform. I can only admit that I wasn't there, I don't understand, but I'll stand by them for support. Thoreau wrote, "Could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for an instant?" And you know, that miracle can never happen. It never will. Our thoughts, our reactions, our needs, they are each one's alone. We can't even share them in the written word or spoken word. Now, deployment can change long-held beliefs. Unitarian Universalism may be precisely what a returning Iraq war, Afghanistan war, Desert Storm veteran needs. A place to be welcomed, a church home, a place to explore their beliefs, their understandings of the world, a place of encouragement, a place to return to peace. Veterans may and do come to us seeking a church home. We can and we should provide a community for their learning, for their belonging, for their exploration, as we do with, I hope, everybody. And to do this effectively, we may have to listen with the same sense of curiosity, with an acknowledgement that we can't even acknowledge the world through their eyes. We can only ask, how can I help? The way that the white-haired ladies did after the Battle of Bull Run. This may be difficult for those of us who have been anti-war activists during Vietnam, during the Gulf War, Afghanistan, or Iraq. The Unitarian Universalist Church of the Larger Fellowship saw that congregations are not always good at welcoming veterans, military members, or their families into the congregations. So the Church of the Larger Fellowship created several tools, and one, called Bridge Builders, helps congregations to become more inviting and inclusive of military members, friends, and visitors, to understand and reach out to veterans in the community, and to foster respectful moral discourse around topics of peace and war. Perhaps this tool is one that we could use. I believe that Walt Whitman's humanism matured considerably during his years working in Civil War hospitals. I know that I changed just in my few months at the VA, learning of the lives of the men in the dual diagnosis ward. We, as a community, have the opportunity to grow in this as well, through our individual study, through a congregational program, or simply through our own awareness of our limits of understanding. Veterans Day is given to persons who are veterans. It's not my day, and maybe it's not your day. It's a gift given in honor and thanks. May your Veterans Day be peaceful. Amen.